There's also been a really big shift in the house versus units market as well.
Yeah, which I guess we don't really touch on very much because we're like houses, buy land basically wherever you can. But what trend is happening? Are people more interested in units
Well,
this
what?
last year?
Well, so houses, most people would know, but just in case you don't, just in case you're not aware, houses generally outperform units for property prices, and the reason for that is land scarcity, because you can build more apartments, you can go up further, so they have the ability to oversupply that market much easier, which creates greater volatility because there's more liquidity and all of that kind of stuff in the market, right? So that's the challenge, and there's been lots of markets, Brisbane, Melbourne, loads of markets where units have been oversupplied. In fact, one of our clients recently, I had a conversation with him because he has a unit in Brisbane that he's living in, or him and his partner are living in, and they bought the apartment, I don't know, for a few years ago. Now Brisbane is obviously performing quite strongly, and they thought, Yahoo, look at this. Let's get our apartment revalued. And it was actually worth the same or less than what they paid for it like 5 years prior.
Wow,
Yeah, really super not cool. So you got to be really careful. You
cool
got
guys.
Not cool, guys, not cool. So you got to be careful about all that kind of stuff, like the supply risk. But what's actually happening is that houses have continued to outperform units. So houses in capital cities have gone up by 1.2% over the last 12 months and 0.7% for houses, which is pretty huge. So
What were those numbers again? Sorry.
so houses have outperformed units. Capital city, so housing index for capital cities. So houses are up 1.2% in the last month, and units are up 0.7% in the last month. So it's a pretty sizable gap. Sydney is where the gap is the biggest. A house costs on average $523,000 more than a unit, which is massive.
Wow.
Huge. Yeah. Capital city houses are now 37.9% more expensive than capital city units, which is the largest difference on record, which is massive. So yeah, it's a pretty wide gap. Now the fundamentals of that make sense, and the mechanics of that make sense. There's land scarcity, there's bigger property, but there's loads of reasons why that is the case. But the question you've got to ask is, what is that going to mean, right? So, and this is, I think, one of the potential soft spots in places like Sydney, right? Because the gap between units and houses has gotten so big that people are probably questioning, well, do we even need to buy a house? Like, if you're in a situation where maybe you're looking at buying a house, and maybe it's like 1.5 million versus or maybe it's like 1.3 million versus a really nice apartment for 800,000, for example, right? If that's the kind of spread that you're looking at, then there's going to be a lot of people who are just going to say, look, it's too expensive to go and buy a house. Can we adjust our expectations? Are we going to be satisfied with apartments? Now, that I think is a part of a bigger trend towards greater densification. And I think that is a trend that is happening in Australia. Greater densification doesn't mean that everyone should go and start investing in apartments. It means that the value of houses and land is going to continue to rise more rapidly. But I do think that more people are going to be adjusting the way they're living and are going to be satisfied with living in smaller properties, etc. I know me personally, like I'm probably happier in an apartment than I would be in a house. From a personal living perspective, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking it'd be like we're going to see an even steeper increase in rent vesting, right? You would imagine, because if that gap keeps going up, right, prices are going up, right, and people are not going to stop wanting to live in a place that they enjoy living in. And so sometimes it might reach a point where the multi-million-dollar house is just out of reach for a lot of people. And so deciding, actually, you know what, I'm going to live in a place that I rent, in a location that I enjoy. Sure, I don't own it, but instead I'm going to park my funds I'm going to park it in an investment property in a location that is actually logical and makes sense and is a good choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to like, I think a lot of people still have that dream of saving up, buying, people in Sydney, everyone wants to like live on the water in the east. And it's like, it's not feasible for so many people. And I think with people growing into more prioritizing their life style for the next 20, 30 years, I think rent vesting is going to become more and more the obvious choice as opposed to...
Totally. But even if it's not rent vesting, like even if people are still buying, right, there's still going to be some big decisions to make. And I would argue that there are going to be a lot more people in that situation in a place like Sydney, for example, where they will be choosing to buy an apartment, right?
Yep.
Versus a house. And what that will do is that will drop the house price growth back a gear as the demand gets soaked up by units. Right. And so I think that there's a piece there. But the other problem with that is that there's so much more supply of units, right? So there's a lot more room to be soaked up in that market. So it's not just going to be as simple as like, oh, okay, house prices might slow down and unit prices are going to start skyrocketing. Not necessarily, because there's a huge amount of supply in that sector. There's constantly more apartment blocks being built. So I would suggest that is still going to dampen the price growth in the unit market as well. Like that's going to still be very, very slow. I think what the actual outcome is going to be is just a dramatic slowdown of the property market, because you can only get so volatile, and you can only create those gaps so much before things start to slow down a little bit. So.
Yeah, for sure.